Okay, so that's cool, but we don't really have a lot of the pieces that we might need here yet. So let's jump in and adjust the look of this by creating our pews and then our floor pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all make a single floor unit, which I think I will make as roughly a 4x4 box. And then I just need to adjust my height here. So I have a lot of different choices that I pick when I do height and width of walls and floors. I usually go with something like 0.25 for my thickness. Now, this is something that is a little bit more complicated, and I'll see if I can explain it succinctly. But when you create modular assets, it's important for you to make sure that you're taking into account intersection or overlap. So the pieces that I'm creating here are actually going to somewhat be intersecting the column, because the column is set exactly to the floor, and the floor is a little bit larger than that. And in fact, I think it's a little bit too large. So I'm going to do 1/2 of 0.25, which is 0.125, which I think actually looks a little bit more accurate. And for right now, I'm just going to leave it a cube. But I'm really going to want to address that whole is it on or through the floor thing, right? So there's a general rule that it is better for things to snap correctly to the grid than it is for them to avoid all forms of overlap. As long as the overlap is not visible, it's actually okay to have pieces that have some intersection or overlap here. So in this case, to be honest, I would probably leave this column like this, meaning that the column would actually be somewhat inside the floor, but they both rest on the exact same layer or the same level of ground. Now, if you didn't want to do that, what I would actually recommend is I'd move the object up so that it is matching with your floor column. So I just actually grabbed these verts and moved them up. But you'll notice that my pivot point is actually still at the bottom, which is the same level as the floor. So the reason for that is you want your assets to match uniform scale as much as possible. And if, for example, we made assets that were meant to fit into a room in Reflections, the game that we're currently working on Steam. And so what we ended up doing is we had baseboards that were all snapped to the exact same point that the floor was snapped to, which was the exact same point that the wall was snapped to. And then essentially the baseboard itself was slightly elevated and placed into position so that it would match up with the wall connected to it, and it would be at the right point on the floor. Now, this may seem kind of weird and unintuitive at first, but the idea is that you want to be able to place things, again, on the highest grid snap possible and still have them work. Now, some people will have different opinions on this particular detail, and I don't think that there's any 100% right way to do it. But what I would say in general is when you're making a block-in, just don't worry about this kind of thing at all. Just let there be some of this intersection, and then before you go in and you create your final assets, you can go ahead and adjust that more evenly. So I'm actually going to make two different floor pieces. I'm going to make one that is a 4 unit and one that is an 8 unit, because I know I'm probably going to want both. So this one I'm going to call floor full. And then I'm actually going to change, before we move on with this, I'm going to change the pivot point of this object. So I want the pivot point to be at the bottom of the piece, and I want it to be at the far corner. And you'll kind of see why that works. But so I'm going to go Effect Pivot Only in my Hierarchy tab. Now in Maya, you can get this by hitting the Insert key or by holding down D on the keyboard, and then you can hold V to point snap. So I'm going to drag this over to the bottom corner here. And then that way I can move this asset on the grid really consistently. So I'm going to go ahead and drag a copy. And I think, let me go with 7. Okay, so that wasn't quite enough copies. So I'm going to need 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We'll probably start there. So let's see. Oh, I need to grab a couple more of those. There we go. All right. Okay, and then I'm going to grab each of these pieces. Oops. Hold down Shift, drag to the left, or drag to the right, rather. Now I've got another piece here. Got to make sure that they're snapped correctly. All right. And then I'm going to just do one last bit here. And this one I got to be a little bit more careful with because it actually has the vertex snapping. So if I want to, I can jump into my snap menu. You notice I kept my snap menu open. I can just turn off the vertex snap for a second. And that way I don't have to worry about it snapping to the verts on the on these column pieces. So, okay. Now I'm doing this because I have kind of an idea that I essentially want to make a middle section that is going to be different from these side sections, but I don't want to like fully commit to that just yet. So I'm going to leave this like this. But as far as on the inside of these columns, I want to make sure that I have a slightly bigger piece. So I'm going to go ahead and shift drag another copy out, and I'm going to drag it out with one gap between them. I'm going to change this from an instance to a copy, and this will be called floor double, I think will be the right way to set that up. And then I can switch to the scale tool, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm using the non-uniform scale. So if I click on the scale tool and drag down to the second option, I can now just type in 200 on X, and I can do 200 on Y. Now, if you're doing Maya, you want to scale them in the channel box, and you would scale it to 200 on X and 200 on Z. Hey, Nick, I just saw you jumped in. So my grid size right now is 4 meters. So I'm working on a 4 meter premise. So just if anybody got in here late and didn't see this, I'm using 4 meters as a basic grid premise. So every major chunk is going to be based on either a 4 unit or something that is half of that, so 2, or I'm going to do double that and do 8 for almost every piece that I'm constructing. So that'll give me a good idea of what I'm working with, and I can make these assets more easily. So, okay. Now I've got this this asset here. I'm actually going to convert this to an editable poly. So I'm going to right-click and select editable poly. You do not have to do that if you're in Maya. you can just work with it, and you can then delete history and things like that as you go. But so I'm making sure I'm keeping these names tracked. So, okay, I can make fewer copies of this. I'm going to make sure I'm doing an instance. Let's see. Okay. And actually, I made too many of those here. Let me see. Oh, one of these pieces is slightly stepped up too. So I want to drag those down. Okay. And then I'm going to drag them over to the other side. That's because I know that I'm going to want a little bit more specificity in the pieces here. So I'm going to jump away from, and I realize I've got to wrap this up pretty soon, but I'm going to jump away from making the 3D architecture here really quick. I'm going to make one of the props because in this case, the pews are so crucial to the setup of these assets. It's going to be really important to actually see the pews in action. So I'm going to quickly make a mock-up of a pew. And again, because this is a block-in, I'm mostly focusing on the shape.